Social goods. Those are goods that are provided to everyone or no one, and therefore are not private goods. And I'm going to emphasize that they're goods, or what we would analyze as public goods, are ones where everyone has some information that's important to making the decision on whether it's worth creating the good or not. And this is sort of an opposite of the problem of private goods, which is really most of what we've been thinking about through the course, though the entry into an industry of a firm, as we'll see, is a little bit like a public good. Okay, so I'm going to start by defining public goods, both the traditional definition and these sort of informational issues that I was just referencing. I'll then talk about eminent domain and what I call public bads. And I'll then talk about the sense in which decentralization or competition in some sense in the production of public goods is destructive, and why private solutions to this problem don't really work, including unanimity. And then I'll talk about why coercion is necessary, ways of deciding on how we produce or how much we produce of public goods, and some of the flaws of voting on deciding on public goods, the ways in which voting can be manipulated, including through gerrymandering. And then we're going to talk a lot more about voting on its problems and alternatives to voting on Thursday. And by the way, on Thursday, rather than having this normal, nice video setup, we're going to have a really fancy video setup. They're going to come in and do some very elaborate thing for the final class. So we'll see how that goes. OK, so Chrissy, what is the definition of a public good, the classic definition of a public good?
It's something that everybody can use and nobody can be prevented from using. And
Exactly.
that anybody's use of it doesn't prevent anybody else from using it. So
Exactly.
it's non-rival.
Exactly. So it's non-rival, which I think is the most important part, which is that efficiently everyone should be using this thing. One person's receiving benefits from it does not preclude others from receiving benefits. There's zero marginal cost of supplying to other people once you've created the good in the first place. Secondary feature is that it's non-excludable. That is, everyone receives the benefit regardless of whether they pay for it or not. There's no way to exclude people from participation. So examples failing the first condition are called congestible goods, public goods, and examples failing the second condition are called excludable public goods. So IP, I think, is a good example to think about in this. So if you have an intellectual property over something where you have a good way of keeping people who have not paid for it from buying it, that is basically excludable. But we know that, like in the music industry, increasingly that's becoming very hard, right? It's basically almost impossible to keep it from being copied, and that would turn it into more of a non-excludable as well as non-rival product, right? And you should really think about this as more of a continuous thing of how costly it is to exclude people. Obviously, if we put enough digital rights management and enforcement agencies, we can exclude people, but it might be very hard and costly to do that. And in those cases, it's going to be closer to being a pure public good. OK. But imagine that we did have an IP where we could very cheaply exclude people. Do you guys think that that would still be a public good? When we talked about IP, right, there was some cost of investing it. And then once you could provide it to everyone, right? And imagine that you couldn't exclude anyone from that. Do you still think IP would be something we would analyze as a public good? You guys have any thought about that? Yeah, Jim.
I guess it depends on your question. Like, if you want to consider it as like a private knowledge thing, like you know how to make this drug and someone else.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the way we were thinking about things before was that, there was some entrepreneur who has the idea to create this and he knows how valuable it's going to be, right? That's very different than a normal public goods analysis, where we're trying to get everyone's information about how valuable they think the thing should be, right? So while under the traditional definition that IP would be a public good, I don't I'm not sure that's the right way to conceptualize it. Most of the time, what really leads something to be classified as an IP question versus a public good question is not this issue of rivalry or excludability, but the question of whether it's an entrepreneur or a small group of people in a company that knows the properties of this thing, or whether it's the public at large. So this leads me to an additional condition in my personal definition of public goods, which is that a public good is something where the information about whether it's worth creating it or not is dispersed throughout the public, rather than being known to a small number of people. Now that's not part of the standard definition of public goods, but you'll see that sort of all the issues that come up in public goods relate to these informational properties, rather than just to the excludability or rivalry. Okay, so one way to think about this distinction is that a visionary innovation, like Steve Jobs, like we talked about, not last Tuesday, but a little while back, these creative genius types who come up with something, know how much people want it more than anyone in the public knows it, right? Those types of things, I think, are not really best conceived as public goods, even if they are non-rival and non-excludable. They're best thought of in the way we were thinking about IP. Because they're mostly about motivating one person to create or not create that thing. On the other hand, do you guys know what Kickstarter is? So Kickstarter is like a way of raising money to start new ventures or to do innovations, where everyone contributes a little bit of money to being created, or they commit that if the product is created, they'll buy it, and therefore they allow the company to raise money on the basis of that, right? And so that is very much like a public good, right? That's not there's one visionary person who needs to be incentivized to create it. It's that you need to incentivize everyone to make contributions towards this common project, because everybody knows about whether it's worth creating the project or not, right? Now, in reality, most cases are somewhere in between, right? Most companies both have some vision, and in fact, even in the Kickstarter things, the idea is proposed by one individual. It's not just proposed completely diffusely. But market research is often conducted even in the most central, even when there's is one visionary, even someone like Steve Jobs still does some market research and needs to get opinions from people. So most things are going to combine some aspect of something that's closer to IP and some aspect of something that's closer to public goods. But you can sort of think of there as being a spectrum between these two analyses in terms of what you want to think about. Okay. So returning to the standard criteria of pure public goods, Dan, could you give some examples of things that are usually considered to be pure public goods?
The biggest one is national defense, because it costs very little to add people on, and it's pretty hard to prevent it. And then roads, especially interconnected roads within a small thing, can be, because again, not much expense.
Yeah, that's right. Environmental services are another good example. So the weather, if you did something like change the weather and make it better or worse, that's pretty hard to exclude anyone from enjoying the benefits of that. Existence values of goods or charities, because those things, people enjoy them just by virtue of being alive, so you can't really exclude people from them without killing them off. Ideas are usually thought of as being pure public goods because the idea, is very hard to keep from spreading, and therefore you can't really exclude people, and there's no, rivalry really in ideas. But notice that that's a lot. We tend to think of ideas more in the IP frame, because it's the innovator who comes up with the idea that we really are caring about the incentives of, because not everybody else knows the value of that idea until it's already been created, right? Now, Dan, what are some examples of congestible public goods?
So congestible, that means it's rival.
Yeah, to some extent rival.
Then maybe common goods.
Yeah.
Say a well.
Yeah.
In a village.
Yeah. Or a fishing area or a park, right? If too many people come to the park, it gets congested, right? Or a lot of infrastructure, roads and bridges are hard to keep people off of. I mean, you could, but it would be challenging. Amenities like lakes, parks, things in a city. How about some excludable public goods, Eric? Can you think of examples of those? Eric Anderson, sorry.
So it would have to be a non-rival.
Yeah.
So would be something like seating at a sporting event or something like that. You can consume the game if you're watching on TV or something like that, but the seats themselves.
Yeah.
You're sitting in the seat doesn't prevent anybody from watching the game in any capacity, but they can't be at the stadium.
Yeah, that's right. And most things covered by intellectual property are like that too, right? They're pretty much non-rival. You could allow people to consume them freely, but there are ways to keep people from using them. Another interesting example of this is land reform. So in poor countries, in many countries, there's often a big landowner who owns a giant estate, and there's a lot of tenant farmers who are really good at farming that particular piece of land they have. Now, if you break up the whole estate, that's basically a public good to all the people in that area because the efficient people to be farming it are the people who currently have it, right? But of course, you could exclude people from that, right? So it's a public good to all those people, but you could always not give the land to one of those people if they were a political opponent of yours or something like that, or if they didn't refuse to pay. Okay. So, but these are public goods, and yeah, Eric.
What do you mean by, so you say most things covered by IP are excludable?
Yeah.
I was under the impression the IP is what makes it excludable, and without the IP, it's not excludable.
Yeah, and the point is that it is excludable.
Oh, okay.
But that doesn't, the thing is there's some things that are covered by IP that aren't even excludable. Like music is increasingly that way, and movies are increasingly that way. But it's become so costly to keep people from sharing it that basically, even if you wanted to exclude people, you couldn't. You know what I mean? Okay. And I think at least as important as public goods are public bads. So these are things that bring harms rather than benefits to a diffuse set of people, and you can't avoid the harms accruing to that whole set of people if it accrues to anyone. So land takings are an example of that, the opposite of land reform. Imagine we want to build a bridge or a research complex, and there's a bunch of people living there. If we want to build it, we're going to have to take all those people out of their homes, right? So that's a public bad, because if it's not worth building the thing if we leave a bunch of people there in the middle of the research park, right? And so if we harm one person, we might as well harm everyone, right? So it's a public bad, right? And it's non-rival in the sense that, hurting any one person necessarily implies hurting all of them, right? Okay, corporate acquisitions are another example of this, right? If someone's going to come and buy a company, right, then all the people are going to have to lose their shares because the person wants to have the whole company. Debt settlements are another example of this, right? So when a company defaults and you want to keep the company running rather than have it just collapse and get liquidated, everyone needs to agree to give up their claims on that company, otherwise it's not going to be able to move forward. The Fcc Spectrum Reassembly that we've talked about a couple of times, right? If you want to have a contiguous block of spectrum that you can repurpose for WiMAX or LTE, 4G type stuff, you need to get a bunch of contiguous spectrum. And so that means dispossessing all the people who are in that block, not just a subpart of it, right? And I've worked on that a little bit. Patent pool assembly is another example, because everyone, in order to form a patent pool, has to give up their patents. Otherwise, there will be one holdout, and we'll talk a little bit about why that would be a problem soon. Polluting projects are another example of this. If you come to an area and you build a factory and it pollutes everyone in that area, that's a public bad that falls on all those people, right? So this is not that different from externalities, but the victim's knowledge is going to be really important to what we're going to consider.